All right, well, thank you for everyone for attending tonight's webinar. This is our Planning for Coastal Community Sustainability. My name is Zach Vega. I'm a community planner at the Land Information Access Association. We're a nonprofit based out of Traverse City, Michigan. And we've been working on these coastal resilience projects for a few years now. So before I get into actually the work that we're going to be doing in Norton Shores, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our project partners as well as our funders. So funding for this project was provided in a one-to-one match from the Michigan Coastal Management Program from Eagle and NOAA. And our project partners include the University of Michigan, Michigan Tech, and the Michigan Association of Planning. So the purpose of this program, and with many of the communities that we've been working with and what we'll be doing in Norton Shores, is to actually study and look at the potential coastal hazards along the Great Lakes shoreline. So really condensing all of the data and really learning what's going on with the shoreline, what's going on with the lake level fluctuations, and taking all of that data and analyses and using them to engage citizens and public officials in these coastal communities to help actually inform local land use policies and future master planning efforts to help make these communities more sustainable and more ready for the difficulties that come with the lake level fluctuations, as we'll talk about today, and as many of us are familiar with, as the lakes are at their record highs right now. So just to quickly go over the planning process that we'll be conducting in Norton Shores. So tonight is our public kickoff, and we'll have two of our presenters this evening, Dr. Guy Meadows from Michigan Tech University and Dr. Richard Norton from the University of Michigan. And we're recording this. We'll have it online. We'll have it on the Resilient Michigan website, which I'll talk about in a minute. And basically the information that we're hoping that you take from this webinar tonight will hopefully help in the planning process going forward in our key stakeholder meeting, as well as our final meeting to draft goals and objectives with the public. So like I mentioned, tonight's public kickoff. The next meeting following this one will be a meeting with some key stakeholders in the community, the people who are really familiar with the zoning regulations that are existing in the master planning documents, familiarity with how those relate to coastal sustainability in Norton Shores. And we'll complete the coastal sustainability self-assessment tool. That's something that Leah's developed to actually look at how sustainable the community is currently and what gaps and opportunities there are for improvement. And then once we have a clear idea of what's going on in the Norton Shores community and condensing that with all the data and mapping that our team will complete, we'll move on to a final meeting where we'll present the assessment results and work with the community and the public to develop goals and objectives for what will eventually become a master plan chapter addendum with all of this information contained within. So if you're interested in following along with this project, we encourage you to go to the resilientmichigan.org website. Here you can find information about communities that we've worked with in the past. You can find some documents here. You'll be able to see the I always get these words jumbled up. The Coastal Sustainability Self-Assessment Tool, as well as other tools that our project partners from the state and other universities have created for you to use in your effort to be more sustainable. We also encourage you to visit leah.org for more information on the work that we do. And also, while you're there, you can check out our Welcome to podcast, which features your two presenters tonight, as well as some other researchers and state of Michigan staff discussing coastal resilience on Michigan shorelines. And so without further ado, I will switch the screen over to our first presenter, Dr. Guy Meadows. Guy, feel free to take it from here.
Thank you, Zach. Is this coming through okay?
Yep, you're good to go.
Great. Welcome, everyone. It's good to be here. I'm Guy Meadows from Michigan Tech. I'd like to also thank our sponsors, Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy for making this work possible. I'd like to start with the ancient history. The Great Lakes are a very new feature, geologically speaking. They've taken their present form approximately 10,000 years ago as a massive Laurentian ice sheet was retreating over the area. And that ice sheet was about a mile in thickness, so had a tremendous compressibility on the ground underneath the ice sheet, and that left the Great Lakes as that retreated in their present form. So the point is that the Great Lakes are very new features, geologically speaking, and that has resulted in some issues that we need to address if we're living on the coastline. So the Great Lakes, being new, are very steep-sided and very deep, and the natural process is for them to widen, and that process of widening the Great Lakes and attempting to fill in the deep bottoms of the Great Lakes, we call coastal erosion. And if we concentrate here on Lake Michigan as an example, that background erosion rate, independent of anything that we have done as humans to modify the shoreline, is about a foot per year. And it's not constant. There are times during low water periods when that erosion rate is almost zero or the beach is actually accreting. But during high water periods like we're experiencing now, with much more severe wave energy and much more frequent storm events, that erosion rate can be very high. It can be up to 15 feet a year in some locations. But the long-term average is about a foot per year. So if you have a mortgage of 30 years, you should expect to lose on average 30 feet of your shoreline just to the background erosion. Now, superimposed on that is the erosion that we cause by various constructions along the shoreline, and we'll get into that in a fair bit of detail. The transport of sediment along our shorelines is an ongoing process in all the Great Lakes. Here in Lake Michigan, it is a larger factor than it is on the other Great Lakes, primarily because those beautiful sand beaches, the sugar sand that we know and enjoy so much on these beaches, is very transportable. And it is the waves that have the energy and the velocities that are required to move the sediment. So the pattern of sediment movement is controlled by the size of the waves and the direction of the waves. The size of waves is directly resulted to the wind strength, as well as the open water distance that the wind has an opportunity to work on the water surface. So in the southern part of Lake Michigan, along the Michigan shoreline, these arrows signify the direction of sediment transport, and the length of the arrow is related to the total amount of transport. And you can see that from roughly Grand Haven south, the transport is dominantly from north to south along the Michigan shoreline and increasing as we move to the south. And it's increasing because the distance over the water that the wind can work on the waves gets larger and larger as we move northward. So it's those northwest winds striking this southern shoreline that is responsible for creating the waves that then move sediment. You can see the pattern is very similar on the Wisconsin shoreline, not nearly as large as it is because there isn't as much sand on the Wisconsin shoreline. The bluff structures are significantly different. But again, there's a convergence of sediment about Gary, Indiana, down in the southern part of the lake here, and that's filling a large void out into Lake Michigan. If we get, halfway up the lake, roughly, right in the neighborhood of Norton Shores and Muskegon, the arrows, you notice, shift. They're back and forth in the middle of the lake because the opportunity to create large waves from the southwest or the northwest is approximately equal. And then as we get further and further to the north, again, the transport generally tends to increase, and it's the waves rolling up from Chicago that mostly affect the northern shores of Lake Michigan. The pattern in Lake Huron is very similar. as it is in Lake Superior, but obviously the geometry of the lakes has a great effect on those wave climates. I'd like to thank our colleague Drew Gonwell from University of Michigan for providing the next couple of slides. So why do water levels change so much in the Great Lakes? And the reason for that is we are in the continental interior of the United States. Uh, there is about 10 times more moisture transported in the air above the Great Lakes and the Great Lakes Basin than flows out the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Atlantic Ocean. So the vast majority of moisture that we see in the Great Lakes is brought to us through the atmosphere in the form of precipitation. And that's both liquid precipitation in the form of rain as well as snowfall. And we all know that some of that falls directly on the lake, but a large percentage of that falls on the drainage basin of the Great Lakes and takes a fair bit of time for that water to work its way into the lakes themselves through small streams, feeding larger and larger rivers, and as well as through groundwater. So our moisture and the elevations of the Great Lakes is controlled by what happens above us in the storm tracks, in the patterns that develop in our atmosphere. If we look at the Great Lakes in side view, Lake Superior on the far left-hand side here is the highest of the Great Lakes, an elevation of 601 feet, approximately above sea level, and it is the largest and deepest of all the Great Lakes. There is a fall in elevation of about 27 feet between Lake Superior and Lake Huron through the St. Mary's River and the locks at Sault Ste. Marie. So the elevation of Lake Huron is at approximately 577 feet, and so on through the St. Clair, Detroit rivers and Lake St. Clair down to Lake Erie, over the Niagara Falls to Lake Ontario, and then eventually out the St. Lawrence Seaway in the St. Lawrence River to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and to the Atlantic, flowing downhill all the way. So it makes sense that when Lake Superior is full of water, as it has been last year and to a lesser extent this year, that flows downhill and following then Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, which are at the same elevation because they're connected at the Straits of Mackinac. They receive that water in addition to what they receive or lose to the atmosphere, and so on down the line. Lake Superior, keep in mind, contains 53% of all the water in the Great Lakes, or another way of saying that is there's more water in Lake Superior than Lake Huron, Michigan, Erie, and Ontario combined. So there's a tremendous reservoir of water in Lake Superior, and we'll come back to that point in a moment, but Lake Superior set all-time records last year, and we have been sending that down to you in Lake Michigan for the last year. And again, to reiterate as an example of water that is brought to us through the atmosphere, this is 2012, October, Superstorm Sandy, sitting over the Gulf Stream off the coast of Florida and picking up moisture at an abundant rate out of the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see the storm patterns extending well into the Great Lakes Basin here in the upper left-hand corner. Well, Sandy moved north along the East Coast and went ashore in the New Jersey region, bringing those rain bands with it and dumping a tremendous amount of water on land, and then moved inland over the Great Lakes Basin and died a happy death, but before doing so, contributed a tremendous amount of water. This is just one event. Most of our water is not brought to us here in the Great Lakes Basin in the atmosphere from the Atlantic Ocean, but from the Gulf of Mexico and from the Pacific Ocean, since we're existing in the prevailing westerly winds blowing from west to east. That is our primary sources of water. And we've seen recently storm after storm after storm that have reached into the Gulf of Mexico and transported water northward and deposited it here in the Great Lakes. We also lose water to the atmosphere in the form of evaporation. That happens obviously in the summer, but a great portion of that evaporation happens in the winter time as well. So when we have ice cover years of higher ice, that reduces the evaporation and the lake effect snowfall. But we're going into this winter with pretty warm lake water, so we're probably not going to have a big ice year this year. So that will aid in evaporation or a loss of water out of the Great Lakes and may give us some additional relief to our high water levels. In the Great Lakes, we have a tremendous record of water levels going back to the Civil War. This is the last 102 years of record, and I know this is a bit of an eye contest here, but this first panel is Lake Superior water levels starting in 1918 and going to the present time here in 2020. The next panel is Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, and again, they're at the same elevation because of their connection to the Straits of Mackinac, Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario. And I'd like to call your attention to this 102-year record and point out a couple of factors that relate back to our rise and falls of water levels. So if we look back here in the 1920s to 1928, 29, we see a very low water period here in Lake Superior, and we see that same signature in Lake Michigan and Huron, as well as Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario. Those were the Dust Bowl years when moisture was lacking from all through the Midwest and into the western states. Farms were being blown away. So when we see these continental scale changes in weather patterns, they affect the Great Lakes as well as a good portion of the whole United States. Then we went through a long period of relatively high water levels in Lake Superior, more conflicted water levels in Lake Michigan and Huron, and we hit our all-time highs until recently in 1986 here in Lake Superior, and the same here in late 1986 in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. Then in 1999, we had a drop in Lake Michigan water levels, pretty substantial, and unusually for a period of 14 years, water levels stayed very low in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron and started again in 2013 and 14 to begin to rise very rapidly, and they have been rising ever since. And we have now exceeded in Lake Michigan our previous all-time high for 102 years, 1986. We have exceeded that this year in Lake Michigan water levels. And again, you see similar signatures in all of the Great Lakes. So this has been a very wet time since 2013 in the Great Lakes region. And if it seems like we've seen more storms and more frequent storms, that is absolutely correct. But keep in mind this 14-year period of very low water levels, which happened to correspond with a lot of infrastructure building in the Great Lakes, and we'll come back to that point as well. So some good news. This is the latest Lake Superior water level forecast for the next 6 months from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's available around the 4th of each month, so this was published September 4th, a few days ago. And it shows the last couple of years and how water level has behaved. The dashed blue line is the average water level. Chart datum is for Lake Superior is down here, the solid black line. These bars across the bottom are the year that for that particular month that the absolute low over the 102-year record occurred. And you can see it's 1926 for all-time lows here in Lake Superior through most of the early part of the year, 1925, and so on. Similarly, the black bars on the top are the year that the high water level occurred that we've ever seen. And again, note here for Lake Superior new records were set in 2019, a year ago. So we broke the 1986 records for most of the summer months in Lake Superior. So we had our high water level year a year ago in Lake Superior. And as you can see this year, right up through this August, we are below the records we set last year. So there is less water in Lake Superior, which means there's less water flowing downhill to Lake Michigan. So that is some good news. We are predicted for the next 6 months to be substantially below where we were in 1986 or in 2019. So some relief is in sight here in Lake Superior. Now this is the same graph for September from the Army Corps of Engineers for Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. You can see back here in 2019 when Lake Superior was at its all-time high. Lake Michigan was certainly high, but you were not breaking the 1986 records. But you are this year. So for every month starting in January, you have set a new record in all-time highs of water levels right up through the present here in August. But notice the Corps' prediction is for falling water levels where you will, again, like Lake Superior, start to see some relief to the water levels that have plagued us for the last 2 years here in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. So that is some good news. So returning to the recent history, on the far left of this water level graph is the 1986 high in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, the 13 to 14 year low water levels starting in 1999 and going through 2013, and then the rapid increase that we've seen ever since then, where we are now breaking the records from 1986 here in Lake Michigan. So this period of very low water level allows the beach to rebuild itself. So it was devastated in 1986, like it's being devastated this year with high water levels, but it does come back, but it doesn't ever come back all the way. So as it builds itself back up, and we'll show you exactly how that happens, it is replacing that hard-packed glacial material that was left by the mile-thick glacier with wind-blowing sugar sand that we know and love on the Lake Michigan shoreline. That is not as resistant to wave action as was the original material, so it goes away very quickly. So the beach comes back, but it doesn't come all the way back, and during the next high water level like we're in right now, it retreats further than it did the previous time. So the cycle is 2 steps back, 1 step forward. We learned a lot from 1986 high water levels. This is a graph that takes a little bit of explanation here, and I'm going to add some lines to it. The dotted line that I've traced over here in blue is the increase of wave energy as we approached high water. And this is a high water event that was happening in the early 1970s. This is 1958, and over here is 1990. So about a 40-year period or so. So what is important to recognize is wave energies, the frequency and intensity of storms and wind events across the Great Lakes, is rising prior to the water level rise. So it's those storms that are bringing water to the Great Lakes, dumping it as rain, both on the lakes and on the drainage basin of the Great Lakes. And that water is slowly seeping into the Great Lakes. But the wind that those storms bring and the waves that wind makes is here immediately. So there's about 18 months of lag from when our storminess begins to increase to when our water level catches up with the storms that have supplied water to the Great Lakes. So if it seems to you like storms are getting more and more intense as water level is rising. That is absolutely correct. The final point on this graph, the, the bars across the bottom are the sum total of shoreline damage that occurs. And note that in both of these cases of high wave energy, the total shoreline damage occurs at the peak in wave energy, not necessarily the peak in water level. So that's why we say water level is the enabler to shoreline damage, but it's the waves that do that damage. So water level changes the place that waves are able to work against the beach. And that worst place for the waves to attack the beach is at the base of the bluff. So when water level is high, the waves are hitting the beach right at the worst possible place, and there's a tremendous amount of shoreline damage that occurs as a result of that. The other point to recognize is that wave energies actually increase by 25% as water levels are rising. So the waves are striking the beach in high water times like we're experiencing now are indeed more severe and more frequent than the storms that we get when water levels are low. Well, how does the beach respond to all that? So when water levels are low and wave energies are correspondingly low, the beach builds up by pushing sand from the offshore region and piling it up on the beach and building a big, fat, and happy beach. And as water level rises, the beach gives up some of this protection that it had built on the exposed part of the beach and stores that in this lower diagram offshore in offshore sandbars. So the beach, if it's a natural beach, it's allowed to adjust to changes both in water level and incident wave energy. And in so doing, it provides a shape that is the most dissipative to wave energy, to be as smooth and as continuous as possible to dissipate that energy. And it does that by building bars in the offshore, and you've all seen those being tripped, the big waves during storms being tripped by those bars multiple times, perhaps 3 times on the Lake Michigan shoreline, the offshore bar, the middle bar, and the nearshore bar. That's dissipating that incident wave energy in the most sustainable way as possible. So if the beach is allowed to naturally move, inflate, deflate, and adjust itself, the shoreline remains relatively stable. So with high water, we have had an opportunity to produce tools that we hope are informative and useful in your planning activities. So again, with our sponsorship by the state coastal zone management program, we have created what we call an 80-year look at the shoreline. And we 3 years ago, did all of the Lake Michigan shoreline. 2 years ago, the Lake Huron shoreline, and this year we are working on the Lake Superior shoreline. And what we have done is gone back 80 years to the 1938 aerial photography, rectified those images, and then stepped forward in time with all the available imagery to create down to the individual property owner an online tool so that you can look at how your property, how your community's property, how your region's property has responded to these changes in variations in water level and wave energy and coastal structures. So this is an example in Southwest Michigan in Berrien County. The blue line out here in the water is the shoreline in 1938. The orange line out here in the water is the bluff line in 1938. The blue line along the shoreline is the shoreline in 2018, which is the most recent aerial photography the state has available, and we're encouraging the state to refly the shoreline now that there's been so much devastation here 2 years later. And the orange line is the edge of the bluff in 2018. So you can see this particular location of Shoreline has seen tremendous recession in terms of where the beach is located, as well as where the edge of the bluff is located. The red hash marks are at the same erosion rate that has been experienced over the last 30 years, where we believe the edge of the bluff will be 30 years from today. And you can see there is substantial infrastructure that has grown up along this section of shoreline that is most likely in danger. Looking at that same section from offshore, this across the bottom is that same section of shoreline that we're looking at from a overwater view looking towards the shoreline, an oblique view. This image was taken in 2015. You can see out in the water previous attempts to stabilize the shoreline with a revetment. When that didn't work, it looks like there's another one that was built at a later time along here, another one back in here. Then some groins were tried, and now there is a new revetment. And the picture in the upper right hand shows a section of property that is revetted, which pins the intersection of water and land, but does have substantial downdrift impacts on neighboring properties. This is a section of your own shoreline, again, through the same shoreline viewer. And if I could just back up for 2 slides, this is a public available website across the bottom here. These slides will all be available. You are welcome to hop on that at any time and look at any section that you would like to look at. It's a work in progress, so you may run into some glitches, but let us know and we'll try and get those fixed. But it's designed to be a tool useful to you. This is just south of Norton Shores. Again, the 1938 shoreline is here. The 2016 or 18 shoreline is here. The 1938 bluff line here, and the relatively current bluff line, 2016 or 18, and then where we expect that to be in 30 years. So the same diagram as you saw before, but just the section of shoreline that is more familiar to you. And this is the oblique imagery, again, 2015, this was flowing of that section of shoreline. Again, a very nice natural beach, able to respond, 3-bar system, an offshore bar, a middle bar, and a nearshore bar, and tremendous amount of sediment available in the nearshore zone, and a beautiful natural beach. I'm sure it doesn't look like that today. After the rise in water levels, we expect a fair bit of erosion along this beach. Obstructions to that natural flow of sediment, either onshore or offshore or parallel to the shore, obstructions cause problems, and those obstructions can be a number of human-induced alterations to the shoreline. This is at the outflow of the river at Norton Shores, and you can see that the sediment on the north side is being trapped by this structure and depriving the properties to the south of a natural sand that would be flowing downward along this section of shoreline to the south. And that has resulted in the addition of revetments all along the shoreline. And here's looking at that other side, clearly a sand-starved shoreline. And I draw your attention to a fact that we'll show later. When these revetments are directly interacting with incident waves, they drive that sandbar further offshore. So you can see there's a big void here in the shoreline before you get to the sandbar where waves are breaking. So that driving of sediment to the offshore, again, deprives the beach of nearshore sediment. There's 2 types of structures that are typical along our shorelines. Shore perpendicular structures, such as the groin that you see here. The purpose of the groin is to trap sand on the updrift side of the groin, which is to the right of the groin in this picture, for the benefit of the homeowner on the north side. Um, the, the problem with groins is that they stop that flow of sand down the beach, parallel to the beach, and they deprive the sand from moving to the downdrift beaches. The result is the waves that are able to transport sand on the updrift side, those same waves are able to transport sand, but there is no sand to pick up other than from the beach. So the resulting factor is that the beach is eaten away by the incident waves, satisfying their ability to transport sand further down the beach. So there's a damage done to the downdrift property. What primarily happens along our coastline is once one community decides to interrupt the sand supply to the next community, that forces the next one to have to build a groin and so on down the line. So these tend to be self-perpetuating problems. Here on the far end, you see that the property owners here decided not to do so, and they're paying a pretty substantial price for not joining in the groin building party. Harbor structures, whether they're large navigation structures like St. Joe, Benton Harbor, Ludington, Muskegon, or whether they're small recreational boat harbors like New Buffalo, Pentwater, et cetera, up and down the coastline, they are essentially large groins. And you can see the same process happening on the small structures, that is blocking sand, building beaches on the updrift side at the expense of the lack of sand and the lack of beaches on the downdrift side. The difference between a small harbor like New Buffalo is, again, in the magnitude of how much is stopped and what is able to be transported around, or as you see in the sediment pattern, transported to offshore. Once sediment gets out beyond about 20 feet of water depth, it is lost forever. It's part of that process of filling in the inner part of the lake, broadening the basin of the lake. So the goal is to keep sand, a valuable resource, the nearshore sand, in the nearshore region and not allow it to be deflected offshore. The larger the structure here, like large navigation structures for large ships that go out to 25 to 30 feet of water depth, that is beyond that depth of closure. Sediment being transported out here can only be put back on the beach by mechanical dredging and pumping back on the beach, or it's lost forever into the deep part of the lake. Shore parallel structures are that other class. Those include revetments, seawalls, types structures of that nature. This is a revetted shoreline. You can see that the revetment here in the north has caused an offset in the downdrift properties. Groins were then added to try and trap what sand remained. But if you look at the offshore placement of the bar, it's much closer to the beach here than it is here. So again, that's that process of driving the sand out into deeper water. On the right-hand side, there's a comparison of a natural beach with a revetted beach. And again, the sandbars are much more prevalent in the near shore and closer on the natural beach than here they've been driven off. And there's this large void, again, of material. So when the water level goes down, these structures are not in the water anymore. They're not doing their damage, and the beach is trying to rebuild. It has this cavern to fill in, and it retards that filling in process. So again, it impedes the ability of the beach to rebuild itself like we would see on a natural beach. So how does that happen? Sand is scoured away from the nearshore zone, whether it's a rock revetment or whether, like here on Lake Superior, where we have lots of rocky shorelines, natural rock features can do the same process as human-induced features. But the goal is to maintain the sand at the nearshore zone, and when waves get higher and stronger and the water level gets deeper and deeper, these are excavated and driven offshore and form bars that are further away from where we want the sand than they would be on a natural beach. Here's an aerial photograph. This is a revetment in front of this home, and you can see the incoming waves here. You can see the reflected waves off that going back out. Well, the reflected waves combined with the incoming waves produce a wave height that is much greater than just the incoming waves, and that is the mechanism by which the underwater scouring occurs. So these structures will fail not by being beat back by the waves, but by losing their foundation in front, by being scoured out and falling forward into the sea. This structure has been in place for long enough that it's also acting like a groin, trapping sand on this beach at the expense of the downdrift beach. During high water in 1986, the state asked us to try to understand these processes by which we're relaying tonight, by which these beaches were able to recover and to what extent they were able to recover after the 1986 high water mark. So we set up 45 permanent survey lines. 31 of those were on Lake Michigan, distributed about 10 miles apart, with some areas of more intense study than others. And with high water in 1986, we started these surveys, planning for them in 1987, and carried them out for 20 years to 2008. So that's how I spent my summer vacations, is surveying at least annually and sometimes more than once a year, from the top of the dune to a depth of about 30 feet offshore. And these were real surveys to real survey benchmarks. So they are real survey data. I'd like to show you some of the things that we've learned. This is survey line 1, which is right at the Michigan-Indiana border, just north of Michigan City. This is the beach right after high water level in 1986. Notice there's very little sand on the beach. The beach is very carved out. Some rocks have been thrown in a makeshift, revetment. There is a road directly right above here, and I said again, we're right on the Michigan-Indiana border. You'll see an aerial view in a minute. This is a stormwater drain, and this drainage pipe has been from the road has been totally supported out here in thin air, out about 20 or 30 feet due to the erosion of this beach. This survey crew is setting up for that survey line. If you were to show up on that beach 20 years later, and again, 2008 is about halfway in between of that 14-year period, starting in 1999 and ending in 2014, of beach rebuilding. And the beach has tremendously rebuilt in that 20-year period in that period of low water level that allowed that wind-blown sand to be placed back on the beach. And for reference, here is the end of that very same pipe that in 1988 was suspended almost totally in midair. So if you showed up on this beach in 2008, it's 250 to 300 feet wide. It's inflated by almost 20 feet from what it was in 1988. You would have no knowledge of the danger that it represented in the previous years. So that's part of the reason for creating this 20-year look, or this 80-year look, so that we can see what has happened to our shoreline. So there was a lot of development during this period of time. And since these are actually surveys, I'd like to walk you through what has happened through time and relate that to how a beach naturally responds. So first survey was in 1988. This line here is the division between water. So this is the underwater portion of the beach. It was tremendously flat, as I indicated, and scoured out, both above the beach where we took the picture, as well as the underwater part of the beach going out. And then as time went on and water level remained low, the beach began to build back. So we gained all of this above water part of the beach. This is the underwater part. And again, the beach is growing laterally as well as growing vertically. 1998 was a high water year again, and the beach was able to, had the ability to adjust naturally. It gave up some of that land that it had built up in the upper part of the beach and deposited offshore into a gently sloping bar whose purpose is to dissipate that wave energy. So this beach now is behaving as a natural beach should. Water level remained low. The beach again built back in 2008, which was our last survey, to this amount. So that beach grew from where we started in 1988. It grew over 250 feet laterally, and it grew about 20 feet. These are elevations above sea level, about 20 feet vertically. A tremendous comeback for that beach. This is that same beach. This is a very famous law case. Professor Norton will talk about this, I'm sure. But this house is being constructed here in 2018 on land that was not there in 1988. This is at that same survey line right at the Michigan-Indiana border. This is how the house looked while under construction in 2018. This aerial view, this is the home. This is the Michigan-Indiana border. This is the this is the storm drain that the pipe was feeding that was sticking out in the beach. And this is a new revetment being put in as the home is being completed in 2019. And here we are this year in 2020. More revetment has been added. And the home is rapidly becoming an island. And again, Dick Norton will go through the process, but again, this is pretty much back to where the beach was in 2000 or in 1988. So what can you do? In high water, and as we're experiencing right now with higher intensity waves, more frequent storms, not much. The time to do your planning and your resiliency and your building of the beach is during those low water years to encourage the natural building of the beach. And I want to draw your attention to this set of panels put through by the Cape Cod Commission. This is again a publicly available website, and it talks for all types of soft alternatives to what you can do during low water times to build your beach back up. And if you were to click on either one of these panels, they provide a nice description of the pros and the cons of each of these alternatives, and there's about 20 of those in total. This is just a representative sample. It tells you the approximate cost of each of these activities and where they are best applied and when they are not appropriate to apply. And they range from living shorelines of vegetation, dune reconstruction, stabilization, setting aside land for underdevelopment, imposing water restrictions. And I say there's about 20 of these, and then more and more aggressive types of treatment, beach nourishment, which is a possibility now on Lake Michigan shorelines, stormwater management, managed realignment, structural elevation, and managed relocation, actually picking up the home and moving it, or critical infrastructure that is in a risk-prone area to move them either vertically upward or move them backwards. So again, these slides will be available, and I encourage you to visit those websites. Tremendous amount of helpful information. So I'll be around for questions, and thank you very much. And it's an absolute pleasure to be with you tonight. We wish we could be in person, but we'll do the best we can to get your questions answered. Thanks.
Okay, Zach, should I take over?
Yep, go ahead. I think we'll hold all questions for the end.
Okay.
For any of our attendees, if you do have any questions, feel free to write them in the Q&A, and we'll just have those on file for the end to make sure we don't forget anything. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay, can you see that okay?
Yep.
Looks good. All right, super. Okay, so thanks. Guy always sets me up to lead into the next discussion, which is now that we have a good sense of why the shorelines are so dynamic and how they move as lake levels go up and down, what are the policy planning implications of that and how do we respond to that? So I'm going to overlap. So Guy showed some slides from the Cape Cod Coastal Planning website that give you ideas on how to manage these shorelines in dynamic settings. That's a good segue into this section. I'm going to kind of go back and overlap a little bit with Guy just to bring home some points. So hopefully this will work. Well, the first thing to point out is, in addition to doing this work with Leah that's designed to provide good outreach and education to local folks and help communities like you pull these kinds of efforts into your planning endeavors, it's been a research program. So we worked with a number of communities to help figure out what's going on in these places and how can local communities in Michigan's Great Lakes, along Michigan's Great Lakes, take advantage of the information that's available and turn it into good planning information, knowing that a lot of communities are pretty small, don't have a lot of capacity to do extensive analysis. And we're dealing with a phenomenon that's kind of episodic. So how do we pull that forward? So this is just to acknowledge the funding sources that we've getting from the state and the collaborative work that we've been doing. So I want to just summarize quickly some points that Guy made over the course of his talk that are really important for policy planning making purposes. So the first to recognize is that the lake level fluctuations that we are experiencing are really almost entirely natural. And they're semi-predictable. We know with great certainty the lakes are going to continue to fluctuate up and down. What we don't know is how frequently that will happen or how high they will get when they're high and how low they'll get when they're low. The best science we have now suggests that because of the increased storminess that we're experiencing, it's likely that when they're high, they're going to be even higher than before. And when they're low, they may get lower. And the amplitude, the frequency of those fluctuations may increase. So we're probably not going to see that really long period of low water levels again for a long time. We're going to likely see more periods of high levels when the lakes are really working aggressively on shoreline erosion. The second piece of this is to recognize the great bulk of that dynamic system is natural and very little of it can be controlled. There is some ability to change water movement through the straits, some of the connecting rivers and up in the St. Mary's River, but in reality, it's just inches of control beneath multiple feet of natural. And so we ought not to think that there's some kind of engineering solution out there that can somehow temper lake level fluctuations. We need to work with the lakes as they come at us. The second big conclusion to draw from Guy's presentation is that shoreline erosion is a natural process that's remorseless and it's moving the shoreline remorselessly landward, but that because of the way the lakes fluctuate like they do over the course of years and decades, it's a dance. It's a two-step dance. It's a two-step landward process followed by a one-step lakeward process, and then two steps landward, one step lakeward. And so over the long term, you're getting this movement of the shoreline that way, but for brief periods, it'll look like it's coming back, but then it'll move more aggressively landward, and then it'll look like it's coming back. And so that creates a huge challenge because people forget. For those short periods when the lakes seem to be accreting, we tend to forget, oh my gosh, the lakes are going to fluctuate again and they're going to come back and we're going to have to deal with changing water levels. So we have to keep that process in the back of our minds as we work on planning for these coastal settings. And then the second thing to recognize is there's nothing that we can do to engineer that process. It's pretty remorseless. And that kind of leads into the third key conclusion to be drawn, which is that shoreline armoring, which euphemistically a lot of folks call shoreline protection, really is shoreline armoring. And shoreline armoring does not protect the shoreline. It actually destroys the shoreline. shoreline armoring, revetments, seawalls, groins are ultimately going to fail. These shorefront systems have so much energy. The high energy waves that Guy was talking about are going to just keep pounding on these structures. And so either they're going to ultimately fail, or we're going to have to keep spending lots of money over time to keep repairing them. And that's probably going to get more expensive over time as the lake does everything it can to pull those structures out of place. So they're not going to stop erosion. They're going to only slow it down. And they will eliminate the natural beach while they're functioning somewhat and while they're being maintained. But when they finally fail, like this structure is finally failing, the natural beach greatly degraded over the long term with lots of swimming and navigation, walking, aesthetic, navigational hazards. So shoreline armoring may seem like it's a solution to our problems, but it's actually not. It's a short-term attempt to slow this erosional process, but it's not going to stop it. It's going to cost a whole lot of money, and it's going to ultimately do a lot of damage. And this is a general rule. It's a general rule in most places. So you really need to keep these three kind of natural system processes in the back of your mind as we work through the policy implications. Well, recognizing that the natural systems are highly dynamic, it's also important to recognize that the governmental system we're working with is pretty complex as well. So as in most states, the state of Michigan has delegated down to its local units of government most of the authority that's in hand to manage shoreline development that could be at high risk over time, given these natural processes. And because we're a civil township state, in between chartered municipalities and counties, we have civil townships. That means we have lots of local government. So we have 292 units of local government that touch a Great Lakes shoreline. So it's a lot of local governments to be taking on this responsibility and maybe sometimes coordinating their efforts. So given that background, I want to just quickly explain three legal doctrines that are really important for understanding how our planning and zoning authorities play out on the shoreline. The first legal doctrine is the power that the state has to adopt programs or to regulate land use for the sake of protecting the public health, safety, morals, and the general welfare. So that's, if you're a local planner, you probably know this, that's the police power. I put up these pictures of these old white guys because this is common law, and this came out of judge-made law that came from way back when. And the short of it is, when the colonies became states and separated themselves from the English crown, and we had to figure out, well, what exactly are the authorities that the state has, especially with regard to the national government authority that we gave up a little bit when we created the national government. What is this power that states have to protect the public welfare? And the courts gave that label. Justice Cheney and was a Supreme Court justice, and Lemuel Shaw was a Massachusetts Supreme Court justice, put a label on it. They called it the police power. And really what they meant was that the public policy doctrine, or it's the policy that and the authority the state has to do regulations and programs for the public welfare. And that's the authority that then the state has delegated down to its local units of government to do a lot of the kinds of things governments do through their land management authorities. So that's the first key doctrine that enables local governments to act. The second doctrine is unique to ocean, coastal, Great Lakes shorelines, and that's called the public trust doctrine. And this traces its way back to Justinian, Emperor Justinian, and the Roman Code codified a notion of what the law should be in Rome, or the ancient Roman Empire. And one of the provisions in Justinian's code was the holding, if you will, or the assertion that some things are common to all: the air, the running water, the sea, and the shores of the sea. So way back when, it was recognized under Roman law that there are some resources that are open, kind of open access resources that have a common, there's a common interest in keeping them available to and accessible by the larger public. And so that included the sea and the shores of the sea. Now this was in ocean coastal settings, which are tidal. And basically what this means is people should have access to the sea, and they should have the ability to beachcomb, particularly during low tide periods. So that was adopted by Roman law. It was then picked up into English common law. So these are early English theorists who made the assertion that basically just copied Roman common law almost verbatim. Some things are common to all: the air, the running water, the sea, and the shores of the sea. And again, when the United States, when the colonies separated themselves from the English crown, became states, and then figure out, well, what are the authorities we now have as independent states? American law treatise writers looked to English common law and held in the and stated in the ocean coast, some things are common to all: the air, the running water, the sea, and the shores of the sea. All of our ocean coastal states have adopted the public trust doctrine as applying to their shorelines. And since all of the Great Lakes states came into the Union, they all have done exactly the same thing. In fact, the first mention of the public trust doctrine was essentially made by the Michigan courts only about 6 years after Michigan became a state, and it's been well established. There's a long historical pedigree of Michigan recognizing the public trust on its shorefront since we became a state. And I'll talk in a few minutes more about what that means. But recognize now that we have two powers that exist that enable the state, and somewhat by delegation, but the local governments, to take actions to protect natural shorefronts and provide some kind of access to the general public. Well, there's a third set of doctrines that I'll collectively call private property rights. So every place I go, local officials tell me, we're different from everybody else. We believe in private property rights. Well, everybody in the United States believes in private property rights. It's a core concept to our notion of property ownership in this country. And the thing to know about private property rights is owning property does not mean that you have the right to do whatever you want with it to the exclusion of everybody else, or maybe to the harm of anybody else. What private property ownership in US law means is you have the right to reasonably use and to reasonably exclude others, and particularly as against abuse. So this notion of private property rights is really meant to be a check on government abusing us as it exercises these powers. So the thing to recognize here is for homes that are right on the shorefront, or owners who own shorefront property, it's these doctrines that are in tension with each other. These doctrines giving the state and local governments the power to act, and private property rights exercised mainly through constitutional protections, saying, but the government has to have a good reason for what it's doing, and it has to be reasonable in its regulation. Well, that plays itself out in statutory law. So it's really the police power prerogative that local governments allow local governments to engage in planning and zoning, which I'll talk about more a little bit later. And then the public trust doctrine is the primary source of authority that the state uses as it regulates submerged lands, the submerged bottomlands of the state, and the high-risk erosion areas. So that has some legal and planning implications. I'm going to play out just a little bit here. So now I mentioned the public trust doctrine was originally developed or adopted, if you will, on ocean coastal waters where there are tides twice a day that come in and out. And what it really did was say, well, certainly during low tide, people have the right to beachcomb, walk along the beach. Well, we know for sure, if you go back to all those diagrams the guy was showing us, the Great Lakes fluctuate up and down. So there are definitely portions of the beach that are underwater during high water periods, and they're exposed again during low water periods. Plus we have this extra weirdness going on the beach because of the way the Great Lakes fluctuate. So how do you apply this notion of the public trust doctrine on a Great Lakes shorefront? Well, the first thing to recognize is that when you own property on the shore in Michigan under our public trust doctrine, you own that property in fee. You own it as private property, depending on how your title is written. But if your title says you own to the water's edge, then that's private property. And that area is also subject to the police power jurisdiction. So local governments have the to regulate those shorelands for public purposes, just like they do anywhere else in their jurisdiction. So recognize that's going on the landward side of these waters. The really important point here for property ownership purposes is that line where the water touches the shore, and then lakeward of that area under the public trust doctrine, any water, any land that's permanently submerged by Great Lakes water is owned by the state. That's a outcome of the public trust doctrine. So if you own property on Inland Lake in Michigan, you actually own to the middle of the lake. You own the submerged bottomlands on Inland Lake. But on the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan, because of the public trust doctrine, once that shoreland, the water moves that way, it becomes by the natural process, submerged bottomlands that become owned by the state. So now the question is, how do we start drawing lines given all of those different doctrines? So let me step through this a little bit. So the first thing to note, I've kind of alluded to this, but let me state it more clearly. The Michigan courts have recognized that when you own shorefront property on Lake Michigan or any of the lakes, you have what's referred to as freehold. In other words, the property line that separates that state-owned submerged bottomland and the privately owned upland moves back and forth as the lakes go up and down. So when the lakes are low and there's a lot more beach exposed and maybe even some accretion taking place, if you're a shorefront property owner, your property has expanded. You have more beach to enjoy. So that's the good news. The bad news is when the lakes come back up and they erode away the shoreline, your property line is naturally moving landward over time. And again, that's just a natural process. It's not the government deciding one day, hey, we're going to condemn your land and turn it into a public park. Nope, this public trust doctrine has been in place ever since we were a state. And this process of this transfer of ownership from private land to state submerged bottomland is a natural process. And what that means is if you are on a piece of beach that's eroding by a foot a year, your property is slowly transitioning naturally and automatically to the state over time. So you've really bought land for a period of time before it finally gives way to the natural process of the lake. That's the first legal doctrine to understand from the public trust doctrine. The second is to recognize that the public trust doctrine also gives some rights to the public to access and use the beach. And this was really codified pretty strongly by the Michigan Supreme Court in 2005 by the Glass v. Geckel decision. This was the beach walking case. And in that case, the court held that for beach walking purposes, the public has the right to walk along this part of the beach where there's clear evidence of water having been in the past. So that means really, at the very least up here, dune grasses come back very quickly when the lakes go back down. So the fact that there are dune grasses there means there's probably been water there in the recent past, within the last 10, 20 years at the very longest. Certainly there's been water here very recently. So this part of the beach is walkable beach. And here's the, you don't have a right to have a picnic front lawn, but you do have a right to traverse. So I'll talk more about that in a second. So that's the first thing for the public trust beach. So let me try and illustrate this a little bit. So again, here's the water's edge. That's the boundary line of ownership. Here's privately owned upland. If you're a shorefront property owner and your title says you own to the water's edge, you own that part of beach. Here's the state submerged bottomland. So wherever that line is over time, that demarcates the transition from private to state-owned submerged lands. The natural ordinary high water mark is defined by the Glass v. Geckel decision, kind of lays out this line. I've kind of put it here theoretically at that point saying that's the natural ordinary high water mark. That means this is the public trust walkable beach. So if you own the shorefront property, you can't run out and tell folks you can't walk on my beach, because they can. They have a public trust to walk on your beach. But you can ask them if they put down, if they're having a picnic or a barbecue, you can ask them to move along, because the court made pretty clear. They didn't really push this point all the way to its limit, but they said this is for walking purposes. It's not public beach that you can kind of enjoy as if it were state park. You have the right to walk along it. The flip side of that is if you're a public beach walker, you should recognize you have a right to walk on that beach, but you don't have a right to have a picnic in front of somebody's home. Just like you wouldn't have a picnic on someone's sidewalk in a house in a city. It's kind of the same thing. The walkable beach is kind of like a sidewalk. You're allowed to traverse, but you can't have a picnic. So that's the first ordinary high water mark to be aware of. The second ordinary high water mark was established by the Great Lakes Submerged Land Act, and it was codified by the case that Guy mentioned, the Burleson case. So this is that same property that he showed where they just built a house. That's the Michigan-Indiana line. And back in the early 2000s, the Burlesons, the owners of this property, went to DEQ and asked, do we have to get a permit to build our house? And at the time, because the lakes had been low so long, see that mark 2008, that's where the beach was at the time. And the Burlesons were arguing, look at all of that beach. We don't have to get a permit because the ordinary high water mark is all the way out here. And so we shouldn't have to do that. Well, the state of Michigan took an overlay of the site plan for what they wanted to build, and they put it on top of an image of what the beach should look like just 20 years prior during that high water in 1986, 1988, and to show that where they wanted to build their house had been underwater just 20 years prior. Well, in that court decision, the Court of Appeals held that you still have to use this elevation-based ordinary high water mark, but they did say, but we're not passing judgment on how you should actually apply that watermark. But the thing to know that I'm pointing out here is the state has an ability to regulate your beachfront lakeward of that the elevation ordinary high water mark, and it kind of plays itself on the shoreline in squirrely ways. So let me illustrate this quickly. How do we do that? Well, it's all based on this thing called trying to figure water levels above sea level. And the mechanism we use to do that is through the International Great Lakes Datum. So it's a benchmark elevation that approximates sea level. It was last adjusted in 1985. You figure out what's the elevation by statute that your high water elevation on a lake 580 feet, 0.5 feet above sea level or above the IGLD. And then you draw a horizontal line back to the beach. And where that line hits the beach, the incidence on the shore, that's the regulatory ordinary high water mark. So landward mark, you don't have to get a permit from the state under the 325 program. If you're anywhere lakeward of that regulatory ordinary high water mark, then you do have to get permission from the state to put anything there because you're affecting submerged lands of the lakes. So that's the state regulated public trust beach, is that stretch then that's subject to regulation. So between that 325 permitting system that deals with submerged lands and high risk erosion areas, if you're in a state designated high risk erosion areas, the state also has a regulatory program there for that point. Now here, I want to show again this house they wanted to build here. The imagery that Guy showed back in 1988, the shoreline was here. By the time the Burlesons wanted to build, the beach was all the way out here. It's moved back and forth. And the image to recall, I don't have it, I should put it back in this presentation, is that house that did get built that's now sitting right about there, and they've had to build this huge revetment around it to protect it because the lake is already eroding in a way and it's already doing damage to the nearshore property. So trying to build on shifting sandy shores is really not a prudent thing to do. Okay, given that legal background, how do we plan for that? How do we think ahead and respond to it, both in the near term and in the long term? So we're trying to think about resilience. When we think about resilience, we're dealing with both shocks to the system and stresses to the system. Shocks are things that happen in large events that are overwhelming at the time. This was the Father's Day storm that happened up in Houghton, up in Guy's neck of the woods. It completely wiped out a lot of the infrastructure of the city. That the size of the storms we're getting are just overwhelming our infrastructure to handle them. That was Detroit from a few years back, a huge amount of damage done, during that 2014 flood. So we have to figure out how to plan for those shocks to the system. And then we also have to deal with the stresses, these long-term erosional processes that we're dealing with over time. And in areas that have critical dunes, dunes are movable systems too. Dunes do not stay stable. They're moving constantly as well. And so when you try and stop them, you can get yourself into trouble. So what are the sources of shocks and systems that we're really dealing with on the Great Lakes from a hazard resilience perspective? It's water level fluctuations like we've been talking about, and then these periods of storminess, these really high damaging storms that are hitting us with greater frequency. How do you plan ahead for that? Well, in the short term, you really only have three core options. One is to armor. One is to start building seawalls and revetments and groins to try and stop these erosional processes. The second option is to try and renourish. Guy mentioned that's now possible in Michigan. It has been done for a while in cities that have a sand supply because the Army Corps is dredging to maintain harbors. So this is in St. Joseph, Michigan, and they have the benefit of being able to pull some of the dredge spoils that the Corps is pulling for river maintenance. They can use that to renourish. My understanding from the state is they're willing to entertain the nourishing a beach using deep water sand if you can demonstrate that it's not going to create ecological hazard. Now, also understand nobody's done that yet. So it's not clear exactly what kind of study you would need to do and how long that would take. It's not out of the question, but it's not been done yet, and it's a little bit untested. But nourishing is basically replacing the beach with a sand source. You absolutely don't want to pull that nearshore sand to nourish the beach, because it's that nearshore sandbar that provides the first line of a protection against natural waves. Guy pointed that out frequently. So they won't let you take nearshore sand to do that. The third option is to relocate. It may come time to pull up structures and move them. And this house is the famous example. I didn't point it out on my very first slide, but this house was built just north of the outlet in St. Joseph in around early 2000s. The city advised them not to do it, but it didn't have a zoning ordinance in place that was able to stop them. They built the house, and then when the lakes came back up, by that time the city had adopted a zoning ordinance, because they recognized if they want to start to armor, they're going to start scouring the neighboring properties, and it's going to do more harm than good. So they adopted a zoning ordinance with a setback and said no structures in this place. And so the property owners had to actually pick up this home and move it back. So relocating is an option. And the reality is, in terms of cost, depending on your location and the size of the structure and the size of the home, it may actually be cheaper, or at least comparable in cost to moving your home back as it would be to build an armoring structure. Okay, so let me just quickly, I've kind of talked about this a little bit, but just to run through this. The pros of armoring is that it'll slow erosional processes, but the cons are over time, and it'll result in the loss of natural shoreline. And the thing to not recognize here is, as the lakes go back down, maybe that beach will come back for 1 or 2 cycles of fluctuating lake water levels. But the more that you have built an armoring structure that effectively is stopping erosion of the bluff, the more you're starving that system of the sand it needs to replenish the beach. So actually, the evidence is becoming clear. If you build these structures and you maintain them, you're going to lose the natural beach. All you will have left is a seawall. The second option, nourishment, that also can slow erosional processes. The downside with nourishment is that it may only last a single storm. That sand is now available on the beach to get pulled off through storm events. If you're lucky, that was the one storm you needed to be protected from before the lakes go back down. But there's a little bit of a hit and miss there. You don't know for sure if you've got enough sand on the beach to provide the protection as long as you need it. And then you start to get into questions about who's going to pay for that renourishment. They can be pretty expensive. The pros of relocating is that it's the only effective way to conserve the natural public trust beach. The downside is its cost and hardship in picking up structures and moving them. And it may mean that if you don't have any place to move your house, you may finally have to just pick it up and move it away, take it away, because your land is slowly converting automatically to state submerged bottom lands. So that's a huge con. And you can think about this from a private perspective. Again, the private property owners basically are trying as hard as they can to safeguard their buildings, but that's coming at the loss of public trust beach, and eventually even the loss of the private beach, because you can't stop Mother Nature forever. In terms of nourishment, for private property owners, it's a way to safeguard buildings, and you have to compare that against cost. It's also a way for the public to safeguard infrastructure and property. The downside is who's going to pay for it, how do we allocate those costs, and how long will it last? And then in terms of relocation, it's the best way to safeguard your buildings is to pick them and move them up out of harm's way, but that raises costs of relocation. And then it can result in the loss of private property of structures as the beach naturally moves its way landward over time. So that's to give you pros and cons. Now there are some options in between there. You might put in what are called the really big tiger dams, the kind of soft sandbags that you can then break open and return the sand to the beach when the lakes go back down. So they're kind of somewhere between armoring and nourishment. And they're kind of like nourishment. If you do them in the right place and you're lucky, you'll have just enough protection to get yourself through the next high water period, but then you've returned naturally to the beach and you've not created a hardened structure that's going to do serious permanent damage. So there are kind of options in between, but I wanted to just give the basic options to talk through here. Right, so those are the short-term approaches that we're dealing with now as people are kind of frantically trying to protect their property. The long-term solution is to start planning for these dynamic systems and anticipating them and getting folks to recognize how we have to live with Mother Nature. And what we've developed here with the help of Grand Haven and some other communities is decision-centered scenario-based planning. And so the whole idea behind scenarios is we're not trying to predict exactly where the future is going, but we're framing out some possibilities, and we frame them from a kind of a lucky future when water levels are low and there's not too much storminess, to an expected future when water levels are close to the long-term average and you're getting kind of normal storminess, if you will, to the perfect storm when water levels are close to their all-time high and you're getting the really bad storms. Unfortunately, because of climate change, the expected is starting to become more like the storm. But this gives you a range of ideas on what we're likely to face possibly into the future. And then we're also thinking about management options. Well, what do we do in the face of those different climate futures? Well, we have a certain level of build out, which kind of gives us a baseline to think about. Everybody that we've worked with so far has zoning, and they've still got room to build under their zoning code. And many of the communities we worked with don't have setbacks or don't have setbacks that adjust the shorelines move. So the full build out is what you could get if you continue to build without modifying your regulations. And then BMP is best management practices. What might happen if we keep our zoning, but we just adopt some setbacks and other best management practices to better account for the risks from high hazards? Well, if you take your high hazard areas and you combine them with your management options and link them together, you can create scenarios. So here's the scenarios: a lucky future, an expected future, a perfect storm, existing development, full build out under current zoning, and full build out with some setbacks and other VMPs. And then you get a scenario for each one of those combinations, and you can start analyzing what are we going to end up with. And you can also pull this out spatially. So this is Grand Haven. The area in yellow is the land area in the river system that's going to be underwater during a lucky storm event. The burnt orange is the land area that's at risk of being underwater from either flooding inland or from high energy waves along the shorefront during an expected future. And then the perfect storm is, oh my gosh, that really bad storm is hitting, and that's the area in red. So what we've seen on Lake Michigan is the topography is steep enough that the really big differences between the lucky future and the expected future. And there is some additional damage with a perfect storm, but it's not that much worse than what you would expect in an expected future. And this is what the city of Grand Haven could expect if they get just the right storm that hits them in just the right way during this period of high water. In terms of management, here are the structures that the city of Grand Haven currently has. We did use some computer software to figure out, well, where could they see additional development under their current zoning code? This was before they amended the zoning code. And then we also did, what could they do? What could happen if they adopt setbacks? So the thing to note here is, if you're adopting setbacks, you're not saying we're going to stop growing in our community. It's not at all about stopping new development, but it is saying we're not going to allow more development in these highest risk places, or at least not permanent structures that could create a whole lot of infrastructure that's at risk of being damaged or taken out by a storm. So it's all about calibrating risk by calibrating where and what kinds of development you're allowing to take place. You can also start thinking about erosion setback lines, either based on long-term erosion rates, or you might use the viewer that Guy mentioned that Michigan Tech has developed, the shorefront viewer. It gives you the 80-year look. That's giving you good information on where the shoreline's likely to be over time. And then you can start analyzing for each one of those scenarios, each combination of a climate future with a management option, what's the land area that could be affected? And what are the fiscal impacts? What's the tax revenue that we're getting out of development in these places set against how much of this property could be totally wiped out storm, and what are the environmental and social aspects of this as well? And generally, when we've applied this in the communities we've looked at, one thing we found is everybody's already facing a current amount of risk. There's just no way we can live in the world without having some amount of risk. That's not realistic. So everybody's got a little bit of risk, and it gets a little bit worse with the perfect storm. But then what we really found out is communities that have not adopted setback are really looking at a huge amount of risk if they get the perfect storm and they're not taking steps. if they adopt some basic setbacks, they're still going to see increased risk. We're living in a risky world, but they can greatly mitigate how much damage is likely to happen compared to what could happen under a full build-out scenario. So a lot of, when we talk about planning for resilience, it's a lot about thinking ahead. What are the kinds of conditions we could see in the future? How do we anticipate them and start working with those? The next step then, the kinds of policies you can adopt once you've developed those planning mechanisms is really two key types. And this now is thinking back to that website that Guy showed you from the Cape Cod planner. So if you boil all of those different approaches down, you get kind of two approaches. One is to adopt low impact development. How do we start better managing water? Put in living systems, try and maintain beaches with living systems. Here's a parking lot. We want to collect this water, not let it run straight off into the river system, which is going to exacerbate flooding, but try and get it to drain into the groundwater, which will slow it down and moderate it some more. So there's a lot you can do with green infrastructure, low impact development, to start managing water better. And then the second thing to do is start adopting setbacks that are dynamic, recognizing that you want to have a setback in place to tell folks the time may come where you're not going to be able to get away from the lake, you might have to move. And you want to make sure that you readjust those boundaries periodically as the shoreline continues to move landward so that folks get onto notice, they're put on notice, the time may come where you need to pick up your home and move it back. And remember that house in St. Joe, this is the setback the city of St. Joe adopted after that house was built. After they adopted the setback, the lake started to come back up. They wanted to be able to put a seawall. The city told them, no, you're lakeward of our setback line. They picked up that house and they moved it back to right there. So they still weren't able to move it back, arguably, as far as they could or should have, because there was an existing house behind it. But at least they got it out of harm's way for the foreseeable future. So those kinds of overlay districts. So really, we're talking about better managing water and better planning for the future, which means recognizing where is it safe to build, and then where can we build. But we need to recognize that the time may come where we need to move back. Let me just finish off making some broader picture points about what we're facing. Some of our ongoing challenges is we're facing a new normal. There is definitely an increase in storminess happening. I know that climate change can be a contentious topic to talk about, but we don't really need to debate what's causing it right now. We're planners. We need to recognize what's happening and we need to plan for it. So that's the new normal that we need to be taking account of. You need to recognize that there are big disconnects, especially when the lakes go down. People forget the lakes are going to come back up. So we do things during low lake water periods that could get us into real trouble when the lakes come back up and they start to erode away again. And that leads to the concern about 1,000 cuts. Guy, and I think I can speak for Guy, our planning team is very concerned that Michigan is heading to become like New Jersey, which is to say a totally armored shorefront, where it doesn't happen in one long stretch through one big seawall, but it happens through a death by 1,000 cuts. The more that we armor our shoreline bit by bit, the more we're setting ourselves up to have a permanently degraded public trust beach and really not to have a public trust beach anymore because it's all been armored. And that's a future that we should stop and think carefully about. Is that really what we want to have? We're also facing increasing amounts of political polarization from every different perspective. And that's going to hinder planning efforts. And I really hope that your efforts in Norton Shores you can find a collaborative, productive way to talk about these contentious planning issues and not get caught up in political polarization. That's my earnest hope for you all, that we can figure out how to do that. And as you're doing that, recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all silver bullet solution. Every place along the shoreline is unique. So I'm kind of talking about how armoring is not a good solution generally. There may be some places where it may actually work, but you have to be really careful and do the study to make sure that it's appropriate in the right kind of place. In general, though, armoring is not a good idea for maintaining the natural functioning of the natural beaches. The other problem we're facing is underinvestment in government. We have been systematically underinvesting in our ability to do good planning exercises, and that's going to just only make it harder for us to figure out how to deal with these problems. And then we're creating really unfortunate policy expectations. So the state of Michigan has frankly been permitting a whole lot of armoring because people are so panicked about protecting their houses. And that's kind of creating this mindset that we can fight mother win. And that's going to be a difficult expectation to overcome. because we really can't win. And then the other problem is once you've built a home, it seems to be human nature that once we have something, we are so adverse to using it, we're even willing to do things that if you step back and think about it in a more rational, make any sense. So loss aversion can overcome prudence. So those are all really big challenges coastal communities are facing as you try and think ahead and figure out how to manage in a resilient way for your communities. The good news is there are things we can do about it. We can do really good planning. We can have public participation before we do the plan. That's exactly what this initial meeting is all about, and getting as many folks in your community involved in this discussion, not just the shorefront property owners. They absolutely need to be there, but you have to get the whole community involved because those public trust beaches are a part of the community. They're an asset for the whole community, and the whole public has a right to use them. And so be involved in this conversation about how are we going to manage these resources for everybody's benefit. We need good governance. So make sure you're thanking your public planners, your local officials, and do what you can to help them make, help everybody make good decisions. You need to really think ahead and try and adopt landscape smart policies that are really tailored to your place and that are going to work for the conditions you're in, and not think about that one solution that's going to solve everything. Think about adopting no regrets policies. There are lots of things we can do, like good water management, that even if we don't get hit by that really bad storm, it's still a better way to manage water. It's going to help clean the water. It's going to moderate flooding patterns. We're still better off. We'll still have no regrets. So there are lots of things we can do that can make us more resilient from high hazard storms, that even if the storms don't hit, are still good policies to adopt. And then I would say we need to learn to live with nature. So we're still kind of in the $6 million man. We have the technology, we can solve this problem, we'll get through this. And that really not very workable when you're in such a dynamic high energy system like a Great Lakes shorefront or a riverine system. So over the long term, it's really better to learn what nature is doing and figure out how to adapt to it and live with it instead of constantly battle it. And that means then adopting stewardship economics. Recognize that in most coastal communities, it's the natural beach that is the draw for the tourists. It's not the beach house that nobody's going to want to come to if there's no beach for anybody to walk on. So we need to start stewarding the natural resource that is the economic base for communities and make sure that that's a viable system, because that will maintain the long-term economic viability for the larger community. So that's my presentation on the planning systems that you'll be working with and how you might start thinking creatively as you engage in the planning for your community going forward. And I'm happy, I know Guy is available to answer questions. So I'll stop sharing here and we'll kind of open the floor.
Yeah, so Ted or Tanya, do you have any questions at this time? I know that was kind of a lot of information to throw at you at once.
Yeah, I was taking a lot of notes. No, but this a lot of this puts into, I guess, perspective everything that I'm seeing or hearing when we're looking through the Eagle permits or something like that about the protect. That definitely rings true right now. And, you know, I've always kind of thought like that's not sustainable in the long term. And this just reinforces that definitely does. So this is something, this master plan chapter, I feel is something that we desperately need. In terms of there are other options out there for us that are better for us.
Yeah, so Zach and the folks at Lee are in a really good position to help you with that. And then I'll tell you that Guy and I have been contacted by a lot of shorefront property owners who are very concerned about neighbors putting in seawall to try and protect their homes, knowing that the long-term damage that is going to cause. And when shorefront property owners get involved in the picture, they can get Eagle to step back. I mean, if the only people Eagle is hearing from are the folks who want to build the seawalls, they've been issuing those permits. So it really becomes really important for the community. If that's not the vision of what you want your future to be, you need to be prepared to engage with the Eagle permitting staff to let them know and give them the information they need to make more of a long-term sustainable decision making instead of just responding to the immediate concerns of the property owners. And by the way, I just want to make clear, I totally understand the property owners where they're coming from. They've invested a lot in their properties. I'm not trying to minimize that, but we really need to stop and recognize they're living in a highly dynamic place, and there's just only so much you can do to stop Mother Nature. And at some point you just can't. You just can't. And you're going to do a whole lot of damage and throw a whole lot of money needlessly into the lake if you try and stop it forever.
And that's exactly it. It's not the fact that you can protect your property or anything like that, but it needs to be done, I think, in a better way, personally. That everybody reacts so slowly, and like both of you alluded to, we think about this way too late in the game. When water levels are high, we're thinking about the immediate and not long term. Um, so yeah, I think having this in place is going to force us to get into the long term mindset, and that's beneficial for everybody.
Yeah.
Ted, you're exactly right. The reason our survey stopped in 2008, halfway through that 14-year period of low water levels, is the state lost interest. The beach were fat and happy, and why would we want to survey and finish out that whole cycle of how the beach is recovered and catch the next high water level? So you're absolutely right. There's just total loss of of motivation when we forget about what it's like in the high water level conditions.
Absolutely.
So hopefully, I think the state's paying attention now. The other amazing thing that we have now that we didn't have in 1986 is Google Earth and all of the aerial imagery that's available. So it's really easy to kind of walk down the shoreline, if you will, and see what kind of damaging effect shoreline armoring is having on the shorefront. I think in a way that people couldn't, 20, 30 years ago, because we just didn't have the technology. So a picture's worth 1,000 words. Make sure you take advantage of that in your planning effort.
Absolutely.
All right, so yeah, we'll use this video to put on the website so that anybody who was unable to make it tonight can view it before we do our key stakeholder meeting.
Okay.
And it'll also help prepare anyone from the public who wants to participate in the goals and objectives drafting to have some background information on what's going on so that they can more effectively participate. So yeah, Ted, I'll be in contact with you about getting that second meeting going, and we'll be sure to put all of this on the Resilient Michigan site.
Sounds good with me, Zach.
Okay. All right. Dick and Guy, thanks so much again. Great job.
Yep, you're very welcome. Good luck, Ed, with your effort.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. I'll talk to you all soon.
Okay, have a
Bye.
good night.
Have a good evening. Thank you.